Bonjour à toutes et à tous, un grand merci de votre...
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here at this conference to protect biodiversity. We're going to talk about biodiversity issues, of course. And maybe we'll start, well, we'll introduce the guests. So I myself am a specialist in ecology. And one of my friends made a small introduction on the different mechanisms of the biodiversity. And he's a brilliant specialist in biodiversity. So therefore, we wanted to present to you a short audio introduction by Mark Mortelmans. There are about 1,000 bee species in France. This is more than the number of mammals, birds, and these species are almost unknown to farmers and especially also the public. The first big characteristic of bee species is that 7 out of 10 of them follow the principle of solidarity. A bee mother builds a nest where the small bees can develop the larvae, and they consume their food, and they develop. Some species are very well known and they are monitored. And this species in particular is essential to our cultures. Bees pollinate over 90% of wildflower species. What about the rest? Well, this depends on the various elements. When water, but there are threats that come from pesticides, pollution, the destruction of habitats, pests such as varroa. Every year, there are domestic bee colonies that suffer big losses. The cause for the decline of bees are well known. Among them, pesticides, especially the neonicotinoid. We can find traces of these products everywhere in the nature. But for several years, these neonicotinoids have been forbidden in France. And there's also a fungicide, SDHI, that presents a new threat. The French and European regulatory systems spend the time and effort, but the systems, the frameworks are not adapted. Once the products are validated by the state or by the EU, the responsibility becomes a common responsibility. This is no longer the responsibility of the companies that create these products. And therefore, we needed 25 years until we banned neonicotinoids. Who's going to pay the bill? Bees and other insects, meanwhile, are disappearing. Let's take care of ourselves and our environment. Thank you, Mark. So let's start this roundtable. I am with Marie Toussaint, and you're a jurist, a lawyer, and you're a specialist of agriculture. Please don't hesitate to intervene if I'm missing some information in your biography. You're especially well known because of the Affaire du siècle. You've started a petition that gathered 2 million signatures, and you participated in a trial against the state for its inaction for climate. But what can we add? Well, you did a very good presentation. And then we have the president of the World Wide Fund. This is one of the biggest organizations that protects biodiversity in France and in the world. There are about 5,000 employees in the world and just 5 million sponsors. You've published a report that is called Planète Vivante. Thank you again for being here. And then Gilles Boeuf. So Gilles Boeuf's resume is very long. But first, you're a researcher. You've published about 220 scientific papers. You're a specialist of oceanography. You're an honored professor of Sorbonne University. You've worked in many universities and schools. And you've been the president of the Museum of Natural History. This museum is not just a museum. It is a platform for research in France. So it is a very important place for research on biodiversity. You've also been a scientific counselor to Ms. Ségolène Royal, and you've been a member of the equivalent of the IPCC for biodiversity. And to conclude, this is something I read on Wikipedia, you give about 100 of conferences per year. Well, first I wanted to make a small introduction because often we don't realize the dimension of the impact on biodiversity. Since the arrival of man on Earth, we've lost a very important proportion of our forests, 47%. There's also an acceleration of the destruction of biodiversity. And 96% of mammals on Earth are represented by man and cattle. And there is something I've noticed is that what was built by a man in 1900 represented 3% of the living beings on Earth, of the mass on Earth. But today, this anthropogenic mass is much more important. We can say also that on television, we rarely speak about biodiversity. So my question as an introduction to the three of you, why do we not speak more about the disappearing of the living beings? Well, I think it is complicated. In September 2020. Well, years ago, we were debating this, and of course, everyone, generally, people do not pay attention to what's beyond their own garden. If we think of certain areas in the world, the mass of insects on Earth is very important, but we've lost about 3/4 of them. We can speak of small zones where there are hundreds and hundreds of different species of spiders, for example. So I think we can speak about the collapse of the number of living organisms. But this is something that does not scare people. So we can observe the phenomenon in the Mediterranean, in Corsica and elsewhere. But concerning everything that can move, we think it does not matter. If we talk about coral reef, however, this cannot move, and there's a big impact on this. But this also has an impact in terms of health. And I think this is why it is difficult to discuss this. Something that is just a list of organisms in our gardens. But if we counted actually the different living organisms in this room, we could count over 3,000 of them. Véronique? Well, to add on this, I think that the connection between biodiversity, climate, and biodiversity and human development is difficult to understand. We talk about biodiversity as something that is rather abstract. It is something difficult to understand. However, if we explain that biodiversity is declining, this is 30% less of yield in agriculture. This is less water. Where we empty our reserves of water. So these are only examples, but this has an impact on the supply chain. And that can be disrupted. So there are systemic impacts that we do not understand. This starts with the carbon sink, with the forest. Wet zones and so on. All these phenomena that the nature does for free, we've seen that with pollination. We see that 80% of the SDGs will not be achieved if we let this tendency continue. So I think we need to raise awareness on this issue of the link between biodiversity, climate, and human development. Of course, we say our house is burning, but if biodiversity declines, well, this means that we are endangering ourselves. And I think it is important to stress this and to give concrete examples. These are examples that happen very close to home. We've lost many carbon sinks, and 80% of natural habitats are degraded. We have only 6% of natural habitats that are still in a good state.
Marie? Yeah, everything that's been said is so true. Let me add another factor that is linked to our own civilization. Our civilization was based on the human domination on nature. We thought that the human would be free once it would be able to control nature. And I believe that we forgot that we are part of nature, just like trees and animals. And I believed that we believed in an illusion of being powerful by dominating our environment. But I think this reason is quite important. And climate is something that can be measured, and it can be understood by the Homo economicus that needs statistics and numbers and diagrams, because our brain can understand the numbers. We can understand math and algorithm. So climate change and the evolution of climate is something that is quite easily relatable. Now, as men and women, we can also have empathy towards our own pets, and we are also sometimes in awe in front of great landscapes. So the question of the climate echoes better with the persons that we have become. But it's been now quite a number of years that we have got whistleblowers such as the WWF, and what we can say that it takes time for us to digest the information and take actions. So we have adopted a law to protect the forests, and it's been a victory for us. But if we look at the situation in France and the carbon sink, what we can say that the French government is not doing enough. So we have reduced the emissions, but reality is that carbon sinks have decreased by more than 20%. And here I'm mentioning the mangroves or the forests. But it's also impacting soils and different kind of lands. So at the European Parliament, there were a lot of discussion about making a proper decision. And people were quite polarized about what to do about the collapse of diversity, because we see an opposition between the right and far right and the liberals about what can we do to make sure people are embarked in the fight against the collapse of the living. Because there we found not only the NGOs, but also great big companies such as Coca-Cola or Unilever, and they said, we need these laws. So biodiversity has now become the enemy. Can you elaborate more about our own civilization? Because I was told that adults in Europe and the United States are no longer living outdoor. So what about the disconnect between our daily lives and our own environment? When you say next to during a dinner in town with your hosts, when you are giving information about oysters, about giving characteristics about living organisms, well, people actually don't care. So what we do is that there is a problem by stigmatization about the urban people, because I know people working in agriculture that know nothing about the animals in their own fields and their birds. So I don't like the opposition between the rural people and the urban people. I recall when I was a child, and I used to know all the names of all the birds, for example. So there is a lack of education and teaching, and I keep on repeating the message. We have killed the teaching about biodiversity and the science of living in secondary school. So there are too many people who do not know enough about basic information. Is it true that we have more bacteria than cells? Is it what you're saying? There is actually a problem of communication between our cells, and that leads to diabetes, that leads to autism. What is the difference between the people who are more than 100 years old and other people? Because they are made of different bacteria, and that is actually a big piece of information. As a living organism, we need our environment. What is more private than our bed? When you wake up in the morning, your bed is humid and wet because you've got many animals that are actually eating out your bacteria and warming your mattress. So please do not tell me that we have no relationship with the living. And I believe that teaching starts with kids, because I remember children complaining about some animals that are too hairy for them. So this kid was telling me that when I go and pee at night, does it mean that I am also crushing the insects on my bed? So I believe that kids need to be enlightened. How come we are not talking about it in traditional media outlets? Is it because it's not interesting enough to the audience? Let me just chime in about what Gilles said. I learned this morning while we were launching a project at WWF about providing this kind of teaching to schools, primary schools. I learned that we have got much less kids going to exploratory internships in rural areas in France. How come that kids do not know how to plant a tree? We need to go beyond these eco-gestures. Kids need to understand the carbon cycles and all the other biological cycles. And it's not only about schools, but business schools and AgroParisTech, for example. They also need to pave the way about these teachings, because it needs to be integrated in the curriculum. So we need to integrate in their curricula the new knowledge and the new know-how about the collapse of the living. About the question about why is it so little discussed in the media.
Mais je pense qu'il faut aussi parfois décrypter en rendant plus accessible et simplifié le texte, comme le fait.
I think that the journalist needs to simplify and to make things more accessible for the man in the street so that they can understand better.
Par exemple, aujourd'hui, effectivement, on parle équivalent tonne CO2, émissions de gaz à effet de serre.
Today we're talking about carbon emissions and carbon footprints, but I do have CEOs who are asking me these type of questions. Let's first tackle the climate issue, then we will discuss about the collapse of the living. And sometimes I just don't understand how is it possible that such skillful people do not understand the relationship between the living people and the climate, because biodiversity represents 1/3 of the solution. Because if you want to tackle the climate issue, then you need to tackle the biodiversity issue. So the fact that people are categorizing concepts proves to be unuseful. During the COP15 in Montreal, it was agreed at a global level to disseminate granular data and specific numbers about the living. And that was a powerful roadmap. And we also have another tool that's been used. And this new tool provides new numbers and actually guidelines. 17 companies have started to use these guidelines. Among them, some of them are French. And that's the beginning of the story. Let's make sure that people can use the tools that are developed and own them. So yes, things are quite complex, but it's been a while that experts and scientists have developed numbers. So let's use all the data that's available. Another breakthrough is that SSRD makes sure that the extra financial reporting integrates environmental issues. And the aim with this is to make sure that the companies comply with the recommendations. And I believe now there is no more excuses not to do the job that's required. I believe that, yes, the living was a concept that was forgotten. So now the political sphere need to embrace this concept. So the European Commission about CSRD only wanted to mention climate. And we said that the living should also be part of the problem. But the question is not only about the media, it's also about the political sphere, police, and justice as well. Today, the third form of criminality that is most profitable is environmental criminality. But at the same time, the definition of environmental criminality is very narrow. But every day you hear about drug trafficking, but very rarely do you hear about environmental criminality. So what about the police that are working on the ground about what is happening for criminality against the waste or water? Because these policemen, these forces, are more than available to also provide meaning to their work. So at the European Parliament, we concerted our effort to provide a proper value to non-human nature. And today that has not been recognized yet. So in Europe and in France, but not in Italy, if you threaten an ecosystem, nothing happens to you. You are not held accountable to a tribunal. Now, if you run over somebody with your car, even if you are respecting a speed limit, you are held accountable. because human loss has a price. But nature has no value and no price if you have not infringed a law that was set by humans. So we are trying to disrupt this kind of thinking. And it was actually the fight that I was leading. I was at the forefront of this fight that was accepted. And now in the European law, some environmental crimes are now recognized legally, such as ecocide. So it is quite a breakthrough, but now we have to negotiate with all member states. So we need all these discussions, all these issues to be discussed by the public, because we want to have people accountable in the same way that you want Putin to be held accountable for the war. So the fact that we have achieved some breakthrough is essential to our fight. Marie, what actions do you think are useful to protect biodiversity? And here I'm referring to quotas for fishing and the rights of nature. Can you provide some example of public politics that have been implemented to protect biodiversity? Well, a few measures have been taken, especially about fishing. We were talking about trafficking. There are a traffic about animals that are very lucrative in France. On the 26th of April 2023, in Cerbère, some people have set fire, and more than 1,000 hectares of forest have disappeared. And I don't know if these people will be held accountable. I'm also the president of a protected area, 400 hectares. And I'm sure that I'm going to lose this forest because of the loss of diversity. Because of the climate change, we've got so many species that are unable to survive in their traditional habitat. But people, it's difficult to also mobilize the public institutions because they have got other things to attend to, such as other types of criminality. So I can call it a kind of criminal inattention of public services. But then obviously if there is a camping that has been burnt into flames because of wildfire, then it is making the headlines because everyone knows about a specific camping, for example. So we need to be more aware about what is happening. Because when we are talking about fire, we are talking about destruction of a habitat. We are not talking about the destruction of the living or the animals. We are not talking about snails, for example. People don't care. So this is where we have to shift the approach. Now putting in place areas, natural protected areas, can be a solution. So sometimes there are very ironic decisions when you've got a European parliamentaries that say that they are going to implement marine protected areas, but at the same time they would allow fishing in these areas. So that makes absolutely no sense. So we need to limit the access to fishermen to these protected areas. Because there are some very some fishes that are unable to survive. You all know about eels, and eels are now on the verge of extinction because of these practices. So when we are talking about renewable energies, we are also sometimes not embarking the right stakeholders. So we need to have all of the people together. Science is not an opinion. Science is a fact. There are some controversy for some science issues, obviously, but some people are experts in nothing at all, but they are given the voice to provide their opinions. And today, that's the kind of world that we're living in. What about the difference between research and science? Well, research is what is being done, what is being researched, and science is something that has been established with a scientific consensus. Because if something is done and something is not working, well, it is the role of scientists to acknowledge if there is an error or a mistake. Véronique, what about the kind of efficient and useful public policies? Let's change scale to understand the priority. The priority is to stop destroying. Let's stop endangering biodiversity. We know the causes. The 5 major drivers of the loss of biodiversity. There is climate change. Climate change used to be the 4th indicator, and it is now going into the top. But now the first drivers are the destruction of the habitats, land grabbing, and exploitation of natural resources. So we've got numbers, it's documented. So the problem is the extensive agricultural system that is no longer fit if we want to protect biodiversity. Let's take the example of the nitrates, for example. We are now talking about 60% of the water consumption in France for agriculture, where these surfaces only represent 6%. So we need to change the way that we are approaching the problem. So it's not about polarizing people and point of views. We need to integrate what's been scientifically proven. We need to find consensus, to find alternatives with different stakeholders, because now we've got the metrics, we've got the numbers, we've got the tools, so now we only need to take actions. Now, if I translate what you are saying about 6% of the surface that use 60% of water, that's because of the cattle. So what is your recommendation? Is it to change the way that we see agriculture? Yes, we definitely to change the way we eat. We have to have food with less proteins. We need to make sure that the cattle is not going to consume too much maize, etc. So it's not about not doing or not eating. It's about eating better, eating less and eating better. But we are facing many challenges with public policies. Look at the national policies for biodiversity. The first 2 have failed, and it's not an opinion, it's a fact. So we've got to do better. So we've got a strategy for biodiversity in the European framework and also at a global level. But what are we doing? We are also integrating pesticides. So that is actually not the good way. Now, about insecticides, we were supposed to diminish the proportion, the use of insecticide, and that has not been the case. So about hedges, what about drafting a recommendation for hedges, but then if people do not comply, nothing happened to them. So we need to be more consistent in terms of the public policies. What about our agriculture policy? It's also very polemical. So we need to be more consistent. Yet there's a light, some hope about ecological planification. But we are now waiting for what will be put forward as recommendations in this month of September. But I hope that we will integrate biodiversity in this plan and not only the climate, because we need to have this green transition that takes into account the collapse of the living, and it needs to be followed by funds and proper funds. Marie, you are very often working in Brussels, and I know there's a lot of lobbying against law. It seems that many industries are in favor of protecting biodiversity, but not the biodiversity that they are working in. So what is your hope of seeing a proper legal framework see light? The economic actors that are profiting from the collapse of the living are also worried about the situation because it's their own revenues that are at stake. But yes, we are under pressure of lobbies, especially for agro businesses, about the pesticides. France has been condemned for not complying with the objectives. So the companies are trying to hamper the process, and we have witnessed a scandal with Syngenta and Bayer because they are accused of stealing or compromising scientific findings so that the European authorities would not access the document. But in the United States, these documents were presented, meaning that these studies were presented in the US but not in Europe. So we are living in an absurd situation. So it's more than lobbying. It's now infringing law. It's proper fraud. And will these companies be held accountable? That's not sure at all. So we've got other operators for forests. You know, forests are managed by private and public owners. So the small owners are in favor of protecting diversity, but the bigger actors that are actually using monoculture are not interested because they are not in favor of having biodiversity and having a better management of the forest. Now, about fishing, there are also other types of lobbying happening. So we are facing a systemic problem. And the question is also related to economy. Because in our system, we are favoring growth and we are favoring the profits of companies. And as long as we are part of this system, nothing will change. So this is what needs to be changed. So I believe that economy needs also to take into account the biodiversity, because the laws of economy are not beyond the laws of nature.
So this is the way we need to go. We need to apply this to every sector, companies, science, public authorities. So we need to put this at the top of the social scale. So I want a European environmental treaty. Same way as former treaties. The big challenge is our planet. This is our framework. We need to get back to respecting the boundaries of our planet. And of course, we need to take into account social justice. And we need to base everything on this rule. Everything that we use must be based on this principle of the limits of our planet. We need to set the rules so that we can get back to something that really protects the planet, the living, and human beings. From what you said, there's something that struck me. It seems that when companies reach a certain level, this includes, for example, fishing with immense vessels, for example. And we have the impression that when we cause damage to the nature, this is when there is an industrialization of our practices. Is this what you think? I see that my colleagues are not reacting, so I take the floor. You pose many questions that are combined together. But I think there is a duty of vigilance in Europe. The aim is that a company should be held responsible for everything in the supply chain. Let's take Perenco, an oil and gas industry. Well, big oil companies give their polluting activities to these smaller stakeholders. So sometimes it's difficult to connect the dots. And we can say the same for other sectors. Then concerning desindustrialization, or industrialization rather, I'm sure we agree on this. The idea is not to make a trial, but there's a form of industrialization that goes beyond our control, beyond the framework. Another example, Emmanuel Macron said we're going to do a decarbonation. However, we often do decarbonation which is detrimental to biodiversity. There's one element that is central. In France and Europe can act concerning pollution. There are toxic substances everywhere. And we can choose to go towards depolluting. This is something that would greatly improve the situation. There's something I would like to add. In the industry, well, there can be a project to desindustrialize, but where's the priority? A lot of work has been done concerning green taxonomy to list activities that are green and compatible with the transition. If some industries try to go towards this sector, If the framework is clear, well, everything is good. We can take a project of green transition, and here I will not talk about nuclear energy and so on. But there was this project of green taxonomy, which was very interesting, and this is something that we need to invest in. However, we do not integrate this enough in our work. We really need to bring concrete solutions. We've seen this in Montreal. There are companies that that have called for action, that have been very present, and that have declared that we should not limit ourselves on the impact. We need to hold the stakeholders responsible. We need to use data that are traceable and to have the right tools. There are, for example, 17 companies that started project with SBTN. So I think this is very important to mention this. And if we do this, we will be moving into the right direction. This is an important dimension we should take into consideration. To talk about the roles and responsibilities of everyone, Gilles, as a scientist, what is the responsibility of scientists today to try to help to change behaviors? Is this a responsibility, a duty? Well, in 2002, as a scientist, when we sign a contract, we needed to make plans for projections, pardon. And this brings us to the subject of responsibility. What does this mean? Well, first, we cannot hide the reality. We need several pillars: the science, politics, politicians and citizens, and companies. Small stakeholders less dangerous? Well, I'm not too sure. Sometimes there are small fishermen that use very detrimental, hazardous means. So yes, there is sometimes a correlation. But let's say, for example, every day there are millions of women that go to the forest and fall trees to prepare fires. And this also has an impact. I think scientists should explain what a scientific reasoning is. 55% of French people say that they're not sure that France has had a good or bad impact on humanity's progress. During COVID, there's been a debate about this. So, what I don't like is that in the media, sometimes, well, there are guest people that are invited that actually are authentic. Sometimes they represent only half of the people represented. But concerning COVID, for example, there have been many issues. If we look in caves in Laos, Chile, we can start inquiries. But there's a sort of scientific trial. Should there be a scientific trial, this trial should be open, public. So how do we proceed? Well, I see that sometimes even within NGOs, the approaches could be improved. Scientists should not be the ones taking the decision, but to try to give an answer to your question. In France, we had one of the best schools of ecology in the world, that was created in Montpellier, and there was a scientific review on this subject that was exceptional. So to conclude, should we leave laboratories to become all activists? Well, this is a good question. So sometimes there are upheavals, there are activist movements, and so some people wonder if they should join. Marie, there's something that seems obvious. Well, I often hear among activists that there are people that are more and more radical. They say, for example, okay, we've discussed this for a very long time. There are many books that say we need to take direct action. We need to lead sabotage action. So what is the responsibility of politicians today? Well, politicians must give an answer, because the situation is important. For example, 5 years ago, there was a demonstration for the climate on the 5th of September. Then there was the Affaire du siècle. But this was a movement that was not only French. I'm really happy that I took part in it, but I know that this went beyond France. So yes, there was a massive engagement, and this brought hope. But then, 3 or 4 years later, nothing had changed. So today we see that this has stopped. We see this everywhere, in economics and finance. And there's one moment where there is the movement, the action, and then it stops. So politicians must help so that these movements give some results.
Est déjà immense, mais plus on ralentit l'action, plus l'effort demandé.
The more time we take to take action, the bigger the task, the effort we need to make. So that from a very long time there have been many different modes of forms of action. There have been actions against McDonald's restaurants, for example, against GMO cultures, and this has led to some changes.
Tu m'as accusé du regard. Mais est-ce que ça peut accélérer, que ça peut ralentir tout ça?
So can these actions really help? Well, all I can say is that politicians are not up to the task. We've mentioned responsibility. Before working into politics, well, before being a politician, I'm also first and foremost a citizen. And one should note that there is also an impact when we see that we are making efforts and the neighbor isn't. We need to try to take action individually, but we also need structural changes. So this is the responsibility of politicians. Do you believe that if you came to power, you would be able to do this? Well, the question, to my mind, is that it's not can we, is it possible? It is we must. So we actually need to make sure that things will change, to make sure that we will protect the planet and human beings. Véronique, another question. You're an NGO, you represent an NGO. How can we make sure that companies have a substantial impact on the protection of the environment? Well, I've mentioned this earlier. I've mentioned SBTN, or Science-Based Target Nature. We've talked about different criteria that are aligned with biodiversity. For example, trying to make less destruction doesn't always mean that we are protecting the nature. I hear many different things. For example, maybe I'll continue with this later, but we have science-based results, and this can bring value. We need to invest in nature-based solutions, for example, trees, rather than other technologies such as carbon capture. Let's see what the COP28 will bring. We want to try to implement vacuum cleaners for the atmosphere, but actually, hey, we do have carbon sinks that do contribute to solve the problem, and that can help local communities. So there are many things we can do. There are nature-based solutions and also transition plans with figures and targets. Then we also need to talk about funding. So our Prime Minister has said something in this regard. But we've talked about 270,000 million euros for biodiversity. This is good, but concerning subsidies for climate, we've been talking about this for many years, but there's a report from the General Inspection of Finance that is very clear, and that said 63% of subsidies that cause damage to biodiversity come from CAP. These are several billion euros per year in France. So we really need to make sure that all these factors are aligned. We need to stop destroying, and we need to stop funding practices that are not sustainable. And we need to align this with the right objectives. We need to reframe our policies, and we hope that will be heard, and the results of the next summit will be better than the previous ones. Thank you very much. I think that if we really want to stop the collapse of the living, we'll need systemic change. Thank you again for being here. I've just been asked to play a short video. Well, first, thank you to the three of you, Marie, Véronique, and Gilles. You came from Bordeaux to attend this conference. So, a short video to present a conference from UNESCO. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy because I have good news today. The government of the Ivory Coast decided to create the first marine protected area of the country. Just a few years ago, I wouldn't have been able to show you these images. These turtles on the beach are preparing for their first journey. Here you have two different species, and this would not have been possible without the exceptional work of our NGO. Since 2014, we've been working to preserve biodiversity. This is a working group to raise awareness among the local population. I found these eggs, and we will leave these eggs here for several months. So the village concerned by this project has participated, and today over 50,000 turtles have been freed. Turtles is a protected species. So this village, that's several villages that have contributed to this project. Beyond the marine area, in a partnership with Rainforest, we've started a project to protect the forest and its inhabitants. We protect this area, and many different animals and also they stopped to trim mangrove trees. Several actions have been taken, and this has allowed nature to have some more time. Thank you very much.
Je t'avais mis braconnier.
It's a leap that you have to